I am Jasper, 29 years old, and for most of my life the memory that has defined me is the sound of gravel crunching under my sneakers as I ran across a lonely parking lot, watching the taillights of the car that carried my parents vanish into the highway darkness. I was 9 when they left me at a gas station, 9 when my voice cracked from shouting their names into the empty night, 9 when I realized that childhood can end in an instant and that love can be as disposable as a candy wrapper tossed out of a window. The clerk inside the store thought maybe they had forgotten me, that perhaps they would swing back around, laughing awkwardly, scolding me for wandering, hugging me like families do in movies. But the hours stretched, the sky turned from deep blue to black, and every vehicle that pulled into the station was filled with strangers who pitied me, but never knew what to do beyond calling the local police. A foster system file was opened that night, a file that would follow me across homes like a shadow that refused to let me grow. My earliest foster placement was in a small house where 3 other kids huddled together for warmth, none of us truly siblings, all of us clinging to whatever crumbs of stability we could scavenge. I learned fast that tears only made you a target, that trust was a currency no one could afford, and that the only reliable friend in the world was silence. Silence didn't betray you, silence didn't abandon you, silence didn't call you a burden. But inside that silence, a fire grew. Every placement, every school, every whisper of "poor kid" fueled me. I buried myself in books at libraries, the only safe places I could escape into, and I devoured stories of people who had built empires from nothing, who had turned rejection into rocket fuel. I told myself I would not just survive, I would carve a life so sharp, so bright, so powerful, that one day if the ghosts of the past ever returned, they would find not a boy they abandoned, but a man they could never control. Nights in damp bedrooms where plaster peeled and foster parents shouted, I whispered to myself that I was forging steel inside my bones. By the time I turned 18, I had scholarships waiting, offers to leave behind the chains of dependency, and a heart hardened by years of betrayal. The world underestimated me, but I was patient. I studied finance, business strategy, human behavior, tools to build wealth, power, and influence. I graduated early, hungry, relentless, unbreakable. I built a company from scratch, outmaneuvered rivals twice my age, invested in real estate, tech startups, and media. By 29, I wasn't just successful. I was feared in boardrooms, envied in social circles, whispered about in corridors where decisions were made. But beneath the tailored suits and the glass offices, the 9-year-old boy still sat at that gas station, waiting, wondering. And then, 2 decades later, they came back. Not with apologies, not with love, not with remorse, but with hands outstretched, hungry eyes fixed on the empire I had forged. They found me not in some modest apartment where a forgotten orphan might have landed, but in a skyscraper office whose windows touched the skyline like a crown of steel. It was a Tuesday late afternoon when my assistant buzzed in a call, her voice hesitant as she said 2 names I had buried under layers of success and silence. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, she whispered, the syllables dragging knives across old wounds. I froze, the boy inside me screaming, yet the man I had become only smiled faintly, as though the universe had delivered entertainment to my door. I told her to send them in. They walked cautiously, as if the carpet might crumble beneath them, their clothes wrinkled, their faces weathered, their eyes darting to every polished surface that reflected their diminished selves. My father, once a man who thought the world bent to his careless whims, now shuffled with the weight of debts I could smell from across the room. My mother, who had turned her back on me with barely a glance, clutched her handbag as if it were armor. They began with pleasantries, with the brittle small talk of people who hoped history could be swept aside like dust. I let them speak, every word carving irony into the air, because here were the ghosts who had discarded me, standing in the empire they had predicted I would never build. Then came the truth. They were drowning. Failed ventures, medical bills, lawsuits. They poured out their misfortunes as though I were a priest ready to absolve them. My father's eyes searched mine, desperate, flickering with recognition of the power imbalance. My mother tried to cry, tried to summon maternal instincts that had long rotted away, but her tears were rehearsed, her voice brittle. They needed money, my money. Not small favors, not a helping hand, but millions to pull them from ruin. They framed it as a reunion, as destiny, as a family reborn after tragedy. They painted themselves as victims of circumstance, as parents who had suffered regret every day since that night at the gas station. But the way their voices cracked only when they spoke of bills and creditors told me everything. Their regret was not for me. It was for themselves. I listened, not as a son, but as a strategist. Each word was data, each gesture a piece of a puzzle I was assembling in my mind. I could have thrown them out, called security, ended the performance. But revenge, I realized, was not about slamming doors. Revenge was about making them kneel. Revenge was about patience. Revenge was about crafting a theater where they would act out their own downfall, with me as both playwright and audience.
So I welcomed them.
I leaned back in my chair, smiled, and told them stories of how I had survived after they abandoned me. I painted vivid images of nights spent cold and hungry, of strangers who gave more love in a day than they had in years, of battles fought in silence while they lived without a backward glance. I watched their faces twitch with discomfort, but I didn't let them escape. I described the scholarships, the victories, the rise from nothing. I wanted them to taste the life they had thrown away. And then, gently, I said the words they longed for. I can help you. Their shoulders sagged, relief spilling from them like water from cracked vases. My father exhaled with audible gratitude. My mother's hand trembled as she reached for mine, but I did not take it. Instead, I gave them a timeline. I told them I needed to assess their situation fully, to consider investments, to plan carefully. They nodded eagerly, blind to the storm gathering behind my calm eyes. What they did not know, what they could never predict, was that I was already writing the script of their collapse. For 20 years, I had carried the weight of their betrayal, and now they would carry the weight of my design. In the days that followed their visit, I set my stage with meticulous precision. I instructed my legal team to pull every public record, every debt notice, every lawsuit connected to them. What surfaced was a tapestry of failure woven by their greed and arrogance. My father had tried to play entrepreneur, dabbling in shady construction deals, borrowing money from lenders who played rougher than banks ever would. My mother had signed guarantees she did not understand, binding herself to obligations that bled them dry. They were cornered by creditors who circled like vultures, waiting for flesh to drop.
Perfect.
I saw an opportunity not just to refuse them, but to make them crawl through the labyrinth I designed. I invited them into my world with grand gestures, dinners at penthouses where chandeliers glittered like constellations, chauffeurs who opened doors with gloved hands, champagne that flowed like rivers of liquid gold. They mistook the display for generosity, thinking I was welcoming them back into a family they had forfeited. In truth, each invitation was a leash, each smile a chain. I wanted them drunk on hope, blind to the trap that waited. I gave them allowances, small sums disguised as gestures of goodwill. Enough to silence the barking creditors for a week, enough to make them believe salvation had arrived. My father strutted again, his voice louder, his shoulders higher, his arrogance reborn in the glow of my resources. My mother bought trinkets, parading them as symbols of her reclaimed dignity. Watching them resurrect their old selves was like watching actors reprise roles in a tragedy. They believed the curtain had risen on a second chance, but I knew Act 2 always ends in betrayal. To feed their delusion, I staged meetings where they sat in conference rooms across from my executives, nodding along as if they understood the language of balance sheets and investment strategies. I let them taste power they had no right to touch. I gave them roles in projects too complex for them to sabotage, ensuring their ignorance was both their shield and their cage. The more they believed they belonged, the more fragile they became. Because belonging built expectation, and expectation always set the stage for heartbreak. Behind the scenes, I orchestrated whispers. I arranged for old creditors to receive partial payments traced back to me, ensuring word spread that the Carters were connected to my empire. Soon, People who once spat at their names sought to shake their hands again, thinking I had legitimized them. They basked in the glow of respect they did not earn, mistaking borrowed light for their own brilliance. And as they preened in the spotlight, I quietly shifted the beams. I arranged for investments under their names, deals structured to collapse, contracts riddled with clauses they never read. Each signature they scribbled was another brick in the tomb they built for themselves. They thought they were stepping into prosperity. In reality, they were sinking into quicksand I had laid beneath velvet carpets. Yet revenge was not just about financial ruin, it was psychological. I wanted them to remember that night at the gas station, not with regret, but with terror. So I began to weave subtle reminders. A child's toy left in the back seat of the car I sent to pick them up. A radio that flickered to life mid-drive, playing the same song that had blared through the speakers the night they left me behind. Receipts tucked into envelopes dated from 20 years ago, gas stations circled in red ink. My father grew restless, his eyes darting when no one was watching. My mother began to lose sleep, her face pale, her hands trembling. They thought perhaps fate itself was haunting them, that guilt had manifested into signs. They never suspected it was me, pulling the strings, delivering memories like poisoned gifts. The theater was alive, the actors were trembling, and I sat in the director's chair, savoring every scene. This was no reunion. This was justice sculpted into art. And the climax had only just begun. The unraveling began slowly, like the first threads tugged from a tapestry, subtle enough that my parents mistook the fray for coincidence. The investments I had guided them toward, on paper legitimate, dressed in convincing numbers, began to wobble. A shipment delayed. A partner suddenly unreachable. A license revoked. At first, they dismissed it as bad luck, assuring themselves that with my influence, setbacks would vanish. I let them believe it. I even staged moments of false reassurance, calling in favors to patch holes temporarily, keeping their hopes alive. The sweeter the illusion, the sharper the pain when it shattered. By the third month, cracks widened into canyons. Creditors they thought silenced returned with renewed ferocity, now waving contracts bearing my parents' names. My father's voice rose again in arguments, but this time it carried no authority, only panic. My mother retreated into denial, clinging to her jewelry, her designer coats, her desperate smile at cocktail parties where whispers had turned skeptical. Their borrowed dignity collapsed, and I ensured the world was watching. Every gala, every dinner, every networking event, I placed them in the spotlight, then pulled the rug. Invitations extended, then rescinded at the last minute. Promises of deals made in public, then withdrawn in private. Associates who once courted them now avoided their calls, feigning busy schedules, their loyalty evaporating in the heat of scandal I engineered. I leaked documents anonymously, evidence of fraud that implicated them without ever touching me. They were pariahs once more, but this time the fall was from a height they had never earned, making the impact all the more devastating. I wanted them to feel what I had felt, the vertigo of abandonment, the hollow terror of realizing no one was coming back for you. Only now, it was not a lonely boy at a gas station. It was a pair of adults drowning in a sea of consequences. My father fought harder, refusing to accept defeat. He came to my office late at night, eyes bloodshot, voice hoarse from pleading. He reminded me of obligations, of blood, of family. I listened, silent, letting his desperation fill the room. When he broke down, sobbing at my feet, I felt nothing. The boy who had once cried for him at the gas station was gone. In his place stood a man who understood power in its purest form, the ability to choose mercy or destruction. I offered him no comfort, only silence, and in that silence he withered. My mother fared worse. Guilt gnawed at her edges, hallucinations blooming where logic failed. She told me she heard a child's voice in their empty house, calling for her, sobbing in the dark. She swore she saw taillights flickering outside her window at night, vanishing when she ran to the glass. I fed her delusion with carefully planted reminders, a receipt folded into her purse, a candy bar brand discontinued decades ago slipped into her shopping bag. She thought madness had come to claim her, but it was only me. The gas station's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sickly pale glow. The same kind of glow I remembered from that night 2 decades ago, when the world had ended for me and restarted as something harder, sharper, colder. My parents sat in the car, glancing nervously at one another, waiting for some supposed business partner I had invented. The pump stood silent. The store shuttered for the night. The lot empty except for us. I stepped out first, the gravel crunching under my shoes, that sound echoing in my skull like the cruelest déjà vu. My father followed hesitantly, calling after me, his voice still trying to hold authority, but it cracked like brittle glass. My mother remained in the car, clutching her handbag, eyes darting at shadows as though she feared ghosts might crawl from them. I turned, looked at them both, and for the first time in years, I let my mask fall. The polite smiles, the tailored charm, the calculated patience, they vanished, leaving only the boy who had been broken here and the man who had rebuilt himself from shards. I told them the truth. Every reminder, every haunting, every collapse they had suffered was mine to orchestrate. Their gasps filled the night like weak wind, disbelief giving way to horror. My father staggered forward, demanding to know why, as though the question itself weren't absurd. I laughed, a hollow, bitter sound that tasted of rust.
Why?
Because at 9 years old, I had stood right here, watching taillights disappear, realizing that love meant nothing to you. Because you turned me into nothing, and I chose to become everything without you. Because justice delayed is not justice denied. My words fell on them like blows, and I watched their shoulders slump, the last illusions stripped away. They were not victims of fate. They were victims of me, and I was the child they had tried to erase. My father tried to argue still, his pride a parasite that refused to die. He said they had been desperate back then, that circumstances had forced them, that they had always intended to come back.
Lies.
His excuses reeked of self-preservation, not remorse. My mother sobbed openly now, shaking her head, begging me to stop, to show mercy.
Mercy.
The word curdled inside me. Where was their mercy when I had begged them not to leave me? Where was their mercy when I had cried alone in strange beds, hoping for a voice that never came? Where was their mercy when hunger gnawed at my stomach and fear crept into my dreams? They had none, and so neither did I. I stepped closer, my voice low, steady, merciless. I told them they would leave this place with nothing. No money, no allies, no dignity. The empire they thought they could share would never be theirs. I had given them a taste only to watch them choke on the hunger it left behind. But revenge was not complete with words alone. I needed them to feel abandonment as I had. I handed my father a folder filled with documents, evidence of their debts, the false investments, the contracts leading straight back to them. Their signatures were all there, their names the only ones inked in black. I told them creditors would find those papers soon, and when they did, the Carters would drown completely. They would run, they would hide, but every shadow would betray them. My father's hands shook as he flipped through the pages, his bravado crumbling into despair. My mother tried to reach for me, to hold my arm, to plead one last time, but I stepped back, letting her collapse to her knees on the gravel. The sound of her sobbing echoed across the empty lot, a twisted mirror of my cries from 20 years ago. Then I delivered the final blow. I told them I was leaving them here, in this very place where they had abandoned me. No ride, no help, no comfort. Just silence and emptiness. I walked back to my car, their voices chasing me, braking, unraveling. I started the engine, headlights slicing through the darkness, illuminating their broken figures for one last moment. My father shouting, my mother weeping, both of them shrinking as the distance grew. And then, just as they had once done to me, I drove away. Only this time, it was not a helpless child watching taillights fade. It was a man reclaiming his power, leaving behind the ghosts who had shaped him, ensuring they would never forget the lesson written in the gravel and the silence of that cursed gas station. The fluorescent lights buzzed above us, casting long, pale shadows across the cracked pavement, and for a moment time folded, dragging me back to that night 20 years ago. I remembered the smell of gasoline, the hum of distant trucks, the taste of fear on my tongue as I screamed for them. Only now, the roles were reversed. My father shifted uncomfortably in the passenger seat, his hands twitching as if itching to light another cigarette he had long since quit. My mother's eyes darted around, restless, suspicious, like a bird trapped in a cage too small. I let the silence grow heavy, suffocating them, squeezing the air until they couldn't take it. Finally, my father cleared his throat. "So, this opportunity," he muttered, trying to sound confident but cracking under the weight of dread. I turned slowly, meeting his gaze, and said only, "Do you remember this place?" His face paled, his mouth opening then snapping shut as realization dawned. My mother whispered a prayer under her breath, clutching her handbag as though it could protect her from the truth hanging in the air. I stepped out of the car, leaving them behind, and the sound of the door slamming echoed like a gavel striking judgment. The night air was sharp, carrying the scent of oil and asphalt, and the gas station stood almost unchanged from my memory, peeling paint, buzzing neon, the same emptiness that had swallowed me whole as a child. I walked toward the pumps, my footsteps deliberate, and they followed hesitantly, fear etched across their faces. When we reached the center of the lot, I turned and faced them, the past and present colliding in a single moment that burned hotter than fire. "This," I said, my voice steady, "is where you left me. 9 years old. Alone. Forgotten. Do you even remember?" My mother began to cry, her tears streaking down in frantic desperation. My father tried to speak, excuses tumbling from his mouth, lies about fear, poverty, bad decisions, but I cut him off with a raised hand.
No.
"Tonight you listen. Tonight you feel what I felt." I pulled 2 envelopes from my coat pocket and tossed them at their feet. They scrambled to pick them up, tearing them open with trembling hands. Inside were contracts, deeds, bank statements, all forged but convincing, showing that every cent of debt they owed was now in my control. I told them their future rested in my hands, just as my childhood had rested in theirs. Their eyes widened with horror as I explained the conditions. They would live stripped of freedom, every decision dictated by me, every step monitored, every breath taxed by the chains I forged. "You will beg for mercy and find none," I said. "You will hope for escape and see only walls. You will know, every single day, that your survival depends on the boy you abandoned." My father's shoulders sagged, his pride shattering as he fell to his knees on the same pavement where I had once cried for him. My mother sobbed uncontrollably, clutching my leg, pleading for forgiveness. But forgiveness was a language I no longer spoke. I crouched down, meeting their eyes, and whispered, "Do you hear that? The silence? That's the sound of nobody coming for you, just like it was for me." Their tears fell onto the pavement, dark spots blooming on the concrete, and I rose to my full height, towering over them not as a son but as their judge. The gas station lights flickered, and in that moment it felt as though the universe itself had sanctioned my revenge. I turned and walked back to the car, leaving them kneeling on the cold ground, their sobs echoing through the night like a hymn to justice. I didn't abandon them outright. That would have been too merciful. Instead, I left them tethered to me, chained by contracts and debts, their lives reduced to servitude under the empire of the child they had discarded. Every month, every demand, every humiliating reminder would drag them back to this night, to this place, to the boy they left behind. The weeks after that night unfolded like a symphony of consequences, each note carefully composed by my hand. My parents, once proud architects of their own freedom, now existed in the cage I had built, a prison without walls, but stronger than steel. They woke each morning to demands they could not meet, reports they could not understand, obligations they could not escape. I sent them documents filled with jargon and deadlines, watching as confusion drained the color from their faces. When they faltered, I tightened the leash, cutting allowances, forcing them into humiliating tasks, meetings where they were spoken over, charity events where they were paraded like relics, errands where their presence was reduced to background noise. My father, once so arrogant, grew gaunt, his shoulders sagging beneath invisible chains. My mother aged 10 years in as many months, her eyes hollow, her spirit frayed. And yet I allowed no release. Each time they begged for forgiveness, I answered with silence. Each time they sought escape, I reminded them of the contracts binding them to me. They had sentenced me to abandonment at 9 years old. Now, at 29, I had sentenced them to a lifetime of dependence. I often returned to that gas station in my mind, reliving the transformation it symbolized. For them, it was the site of betrayal long buried but never forgotten. For me, it was the crucible that had forged my resolve. I stood on that cracked pavement as a child once, powerless, desperate, voiceless. Now, when I drove past under the glow of neon lights, I was not that child. I was the storm that followed. Sometimes I would bring them back there, forcing them to stand in the same spot where I had cried for them, demanding they remember the silence of that night. My father could barely stand during those visits, his legs trembling, while my mother wept openly, clutching my arm in desperation I never acknowledged. I let them drown in their memories, their shame, their fear, because I wanted them to live every moment as I had lived mine, alone in a world that had turned its back. But revenge, though satisfying, is never clean. There were nights when I lay awake in my penthouse, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the 9-year-old inside me had found peace, or if I had simply built another prison, this one for myself. I asked if cruelty could ever erase the scars of abandonment, if their tears could ever stitch the fabric of my broken childhood. The truth was bitter. Vengeance did not heal, it only prolonged the wound. Yet even as I acknowledged that truth, I could not let them go. To release them would be to absolve them, and that was a mercy I refused to grant. They had chosen their path when they drove away from me, and my path was carved from the ruins they left behind. The empire I had built was not only for me, but for the child they tried to erase. Every skyscraper, every contract, every victory was proof that I had survived without them, despite them, because of them. And so the story came full circle. I was no longer Jasper the orphan, Jasper the forgotten, Jasper the abandoned. I was Jasper the architect of fate, the master of vengeance, the man who had turned silence into a weapon sharper than any blade. My parents lived in the shadow of my power, every day a reminder of the night they threw away their son. They had wanted something from me, 20 years later, but what they received was not salvation. It was judgment. Judgment delivered not in anger, but in cold, calculated precision. And as they lived out their days chained to the empire they once thought they could exploit, I carried forward not with forgiveness, but with purpose. For the boy at the gas station deserved nothing less than justice, and I had delivered it in full measure. So when you hear my story, remember this: abandonment may scar you, betrayal may shape you, but survival can turn pain into power. I am Jasper, 29 years old, the child who was left behind, and the man who chose not to forget. And if my journey tells you anything, it is this: never underestimate the resilience of the forgotten, for they can grow into the storms you never see coming.